So thank you all for joining us. This is our kickoff for a series that we're doing on interconnected systems framework. We're going to be doing a series over the next several weeks, and we'll talk about this a little later, where we're going to have these conversations about setting up your systems, followed by later in the week a session on specific practices. So we're glad you could join us today. I'm Kelsey Schmitz, and I work for the University of Washington at the SMART Center, the School Mental Health Assessment Research and Training Center. And I'm the School Mental Health Lead to the Northwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. Our center is located in Seattle. So our funder, SAMHSA, asks that we provide this disclaimer that the views, opinions, and content expressed in the presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, SAMHSA, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The University of Washington SMART Center and the Northwest MHTTC acknowledge that we learn, live, and work on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people who walked here before us and those who still walk here. We are grateful to respectfully live and work as guests on these lands with the Coast Salish and Native people who call this home. We are also doing these series in collaboration with the Pacific Southwest MHTTC, and they're led by the Center for Applied Research Solutions, and they have offices across California, in Sacramento, the land of the Nisenan people, Santa Rosa, the land of the Kawiak bands, and Los Angeles, the land of the Tongva peoples. CARS acknowledges the belonging of this land to the indigenous people named and the unrecognized tribes and peoples as well. We hope that all of you take time to learn about the ancestral lands that you're joining us from. As a reminder for those who have joined us before and our new friends today, the MHTTC network was funded by SAMHSA in 2018 and includes 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. And again, this series is being sponsored by 2 of those centers, which you can see are located next to the arrows, the Pacific Southwest and Northwest MHTTCs. We know that many of you are joining us perhaps outside of our region, and we want to make sure that you know that you also have regional supports to help your school mental health efforts. So as a brief review, we started a series last October about this time, which is hard to believe that it's been a year, based on the interconnected systems framework. And there were 3 fact sheets that were created by the Pacific Southwest MHTTC and our lead presenter, Susan Barrett. And we based a series of webinars off those fact sheets. And then, given the interest that people had, we continued to meet for discussion hours through August last year. And this year, we've done a better job of blending the systems, the data, and practices sessions from last year into a series that really provides for more integrated programming to deepen this content. We have 4 sessions with Susan Barrett and other field experts, and 6 sessions with our University of Southern California staff, and then a town hall style format where we'll bring them all back together. As I mentioned, Susan's sessions will focus more on the systems and the structures, pulling heavily from the newly released ISF implementation guide, which we'll make sure you have the link to that guide. And then the USC sessions will again focus on trauma-informed practices. You're welcome to just attend the systems sessions, or just the practices sessions, or all of them. And we're really going to encourage you to bring your teams for these sessions as well to maximize your input. And then just to let you know, the session that's coming up this Thursday is with Dr. Stephen Hayden from USC, and he's going to focus on secondary traumatic stress and educator well-being. And he's going to share a new free online training called Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma. All right, and in this next slide, I'm going to introduce our guest speakers that we have joining us today. I'm excited that we have Susan Barrett, who's the director of the Center for Social Behavioral Supports at Old Dominion University and also an implementer partner with the U.S. National Technical Assistance Center on PBIS. And we also have the amazing Dr. Jessica Swain Bradway, who's the executive director of Northwest PBIS. And at this point, I just want to welcome you both on. It's always fun to do these things with you. You always bring so much great content and information and a side of humor along with all of it. So it's great to have you both here. And I'll turn it over to you, Susan.
Great. Thank you so much, Kelsey. And thanks to everyone who have joined us this afternoon. It's really amazing to see the interest in this topic. And so we're going to geek out this afternoon with you. We really wanted to set the stage for this series, again, to echo Kelsey's introduction. We are really incredibly fortunate to be able to put a series like this together for you, because it does something that I think a lot of professional development trainings don't do, in that we are going to build our content knowledge and our expertise around trauma-informed practices, but we're also going to look at the systems and structures that shape the behavior. And we want to be sure that as we learn a little bit more about the content knowledge and the skills and strategies, that we take time to install it within a multi-tiered system of support. So we're going to start the session at the larger kind of balcony view to make sure we all kind of ground ourselves in some common knowledge about these terms we have a tendency to throw around, right? Like PBIS, Positive Behavior Interventions and Support. So we're going to walk you through a process by which we are bringing the mental health system and we're connecting it to the framework, and we're expanding the framework to include our community partners, our child serving agencies, and our families and our students. We're also going to talk and describe today really explicitly the MTSS core features in the context of the virtual conditions. So that kind of just sets the stage for our time together this afternoon. Again, if you have any questions or want to take a deeper dive into some of the resources that we're describing for you today, please don't hesitate to engage with us using the chat feature. We also want to model some self-care as we go along this ISF and trauma series. And one of the things we just want to call our attention to is this notion that we use the teaching matrix in a lot of our schools to be really clear and explicit about what we expect our community members to say and do. And so in the same way, we want to make sure that our adults are taken care of, and we're creating a culture of wellness, not only for our students and our families, but for our adults. And we recognize how stressful this time is. We are dealing with multiple crises at the same time. And so we want to be really careful in making sure that we are being safe, being engaged, and being respectful as it relates to our self-care practices. And so under the safety goal, we want to be able to make sure that you are taking time out to create an emotional support team, a friend group that you are checking in with, that you are connecting with, that you can socialize even in the virtual space. We also want to make sure that we're double checking the status of each other. And if we do feel like we're getting ourselves in trouble, that there are ways to connect either with local warm lines, suicide hotline, or the new 988 number that is in play right now for some specific mental health supports. Want to make sure that we're also engaged. And that means really paying close attention to our own stress levels, recognizing and naming those emotions that we're experiencing, paying attention to joy in moments of grace, and doing body checks and checking for areas of tightness and discomfort, and taking movement breaks. And thank you for letting us know that the 988 doesn't work quite yet. I think they just passed this legislation yesterday, and I think it's going to take a couple hopefully weeks, and to kind of get that posted, but we just wanted to make sure that you were aware that that is coming soon. And then finally, being respectful, right? Nurturing our body with healthy food, building calming routines for sleep, and building a routine for daily exercise. And we feel like if we can create a culture where we're looking out for each other to build and shape our routines as caregivers, that's going to go a long way in helping us de-stress and be able to provide supports, specifically emotional supports for the students and families that we're working with each and every day. We already had a pre-COVID mental health crisis, right? We already had some data that was really concerning prior to COVID, right? We knew that 1 in 5 youth pre-March had a mental health condition. We knew that at least 50%, perhaps 80% get no treatment at all. We know that about 23% actually get services inside the school. And in many cases, school ends up being the de facto mental health provider. We know that students that receive evidence-based treatment within schools are 6 times more likely to finish that series of treatment. And we know that when students aren't successful within schools and we aren't successful at supporting them, that juvenile justice system, unfortunately, is the next level of system of default. We know that suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death among young adults in our country. And we know that the factors that impact our mental health functioning occur round the clock, and things that happen in the community and with our families and in our neighborhoods impact our ability to be successful within school. So being able to look up and expand and look at patterns that are occurring in the community is going to be really important as we reposition our teams to not only look at school level data, but also the trends that are happening in the community. And we'll be giving you some examples about that. We know that this is far more challenging than any one system can do on their own. So the partnerships that we establish with other child and youth serving agencies within our communities is going to be very, very powerful. So bottom line is that the interconnected system framework, this enhancement effort launching from the PBIS or MTSS work, which we'll describe a little bit in a minute, is really about disrupting the status quo. And one of the things we can take advantage of in this kind of COVID times, if you will, is this notion and recognition that this system wasn't working for everybody to begin with. And we should fight to disrupt the status quo to ensure that we never go back to what we had before. Because one of the things that COVID has done as it's exposed the impact on our Black, Brown, and migrant communities and our vulnerable populations at a much higher rate. And that this is rooted in social inequalities like generational residential segregation and differential access to healthcare and treatment. So the bottom line is this is about bringing partners together within our community and really questioning everything as we redesign and the system to ensure that everybody is successful. And underlying that is the fact that race is not a risk factor, but racism is. So as we think about disrupting the status quo and advancing racial equity within the work that we're doing each and every day, we have kids currently walking into our Zoom classrooms, and someday soon, we're going to have students who are going to be walking into our physical space, our classrooms, right? And that's going to be such an exciting time. We want to make sure as we are resetting the stage for making sure that everybody succeeds within our community, that we are all very much aware of the persistent racial disparities in health status, access to healthcare, wealth, employment, wages, housing, income, and poverty, because that's going to set the stage for our ability as a district community to reallocate resources and identify when we need to ramp up resources for certain populations and groups of people who've been underserved for generations within our country. We want to make sure that you personally are aware of some of the wide racial inequities that are occurring across education, health, and workforce. And we wanted to call your attention to some testimony that was that was before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Labor and Education, and that link is provided for you. And in the next slide, you can see that some of the graphs that were displayed during that testimony, dealing with evidence to date that suggests that Black and Hispanic workers face much more of an economic and health insecurity. And that's going to be really important as, again, we drive this notion that we're going to build a resilient community, but we're going to do it in an equitable way. So to what extent can we make sure that every child serving partner we're engaged with has an understanding of this data? Because just like we need to be trauma informed, we also need to be informed about the way that many of our population are really being underserved. There's been some really incredible forecasting data, and the news isn't great, but it's nice to be able to have our public health systems, and this is an example from Washington State Department of Health, who are telling us in advance what we should expect to see. And over the next several months, we know that COVID numbers are rising, but we also are going to see a wave of need around the increase in depressive symptoms and the highest risk of suicide likely to occur between October and December of 2020. And this forecasting data isn't even looking, this is just looking at COVID related crisis. This isn't configuring in the social justice and environmental crisis or weather related crisis we find ourselves in. This is just looking at COVID. So with the multiple crises, we are likely to see a surge of behavioral health need, which again, it is call to action on all of us to invest in efforts that not necessarily add more to our plate, but really augment where our strengths are within our community, that activate existing community critical friends that we already have engaged with, and that we are going to take a priority for creating a resilient community, because resilience can be intentionally taught. Right? We can repair a lot of the harm that has been done through generational trauma and the inequities that have permeated our community. But in the new stress that's occurred with the multiple crises we've had over the last 6 to 9 months, we know our way back will mean that we'll need intentional focus on instruction. What are the replacement skills and strategies we need ourselves and we need to teach? And how do we have community members that include volunteers and all manners of social organizations to invest with us in this common way of work, this common approach? And the launching pad for this will be the PBIS and MTSS framework. I just want to kind of end this setup with a couple of things, right? We know that today it's never been more clear that mental health is a top priority, not only for our schools, but our larger community context. We know we have to put in systems that rearrange our behaviors and shape our behaviors into new routines, and use an instructional approach when we're talking about meeting the vast majority of need and managing their anxiety and depression to ensure that we're setting up conditions for learning. We know a comprehensive system that's agile is going to be really important. And we know that data and science matter. And we need to use that data so that we can work effectively and efficiently in directing our resources to the right place at the right time. We know that prevention and intervention at the first sign of need will pay off. We can no longer afford to wait for a label, a diagnosis, or an insurance plan. At the first sign of need, we need to create a system where we don't need that label to provide support. If you need support, we will guarantee that you will get it. You will get evidence-based treatment, and we are going to monitor the impact it has on your life outcomes. And above all, people and relationships and our ability to bring and coalesce our community partners together inside what we've developed in the infrastructure within education is going to be key above all else. One of the things that we want to highlight is a new brief that, that we just launched from our PBIS Center. And we, one of the things that we highlight in the upfront section is a lit review on what we've learned so far about the effects of trauma-informed approaches in school. And it's awesome that there's a lot of attention to it. It's awesome that, that we're doing a lot of training, right? We're getting a lot of content knowledge out there. What's unclear, however, is that we haven't demonstrated outcomes yet. And it's unclear exactly what schools are doing to be trauma-informed. It's also a little bit unclear if we're tracking fidelity, right? If we're going to ask adults to do something different or learn about something and be trauma-informed, what are the fidelity metrics we're going to use to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable for high-quality implementation? And then finally, by training on trauma-informed, to what extent does it have impact on students, right? So this is right now, the current condition is really worrisome, right? We're spending a lot of money, we're spinning our wheels, it's getting a lot of attention, which is awesome on one hand. On the other hand, we're missing that installation and the guiding systemic forces and steps we need to invest in to make sure that what we are doing actually meets the need and students are benefiting from it. So that's where PBIS and MTSS core features are really going to come into play. So let's start to take a look at what PBIS has done so far across the country for schools and school systems. So I want to be really clear about what PBIS is and what it's not. PBIS is a framework that helps teams across state, region, county offices, districts, and schools create a symmetry of process across that cascade and invest in a team-based approach where we're looking at the effectiveness, efficiency, and equity of schools. We are about improving the social, emotional, and academic outcomes for all students, including students with disabilities and students from underrepresented groups. So it's a problem-solving framework. We never come in and dictate what it's going to look like and sound like. We actually provide steps that guide a team to decide what's best for their community, what has evidence. And then we set up a progress monitoring system, again, to make sure that what we invest in actually gets implemented well and that students and families and adults benefit from that. We know that PBIS is not enough. We know we need to expand it. And we've been working for the last decade or so on expanding the platform of PBIS to include other child-serving entities and to include families and students to own this and be charged with being leaders in this space. So we coined a new term called the Interconnected Systems Framework. And this term is about the deliberate application of using that PBIS and MTSS, that framework, to deliberately integrate all of the social emotional behavior interventions into one single system. The ISF is about aligning those through that single system at the state, the region, the district, and the school level. And finally, it's guided by the active participation and leadership of family and youth and community partners. And they are central to making this expansion effort work. There are 4 key features with the Interconnected System Framework. The first is we want to invest in a single set of teams. Now, too often when a shiny new initiative comes into our lives, like trauma-informed care, we create a separate team, right? Because we want this to take hold, we want it to have priority. But when we set up a separate team, we are siloing it off to be seen as a separate initiative. So one of the things we are going to try to do is stay really lean with our teaming structures and invest in a team at tier 1, at tier 2, and at tier 3 that's paying really close attention to the systems and structures that shape our behavior as as staff members within that community. So we want to invest in one set of teams. Number two, access is not enough. The mental health outcomes that we select for ourselves shouldn't be revolving around the number of referrals and services. We should be drilling into what is going to change in the student's life. So success is always going to be defined by outcomes, right? We would never hold have a reading group or a reading class or a math class and count attendance and call that an outcome, right? So similarly, we want to use that same logic when we're applying social emotional behavior supports. What are kids
going to use when they're stressed? And how are we going to track to make sure that it's benefiting their life outcomes? Number three, mental health is for all. I think that the last 6 to 9 months has really let everyone in the world know how important our mental health and wellness is, and how many skills and strategies we really need when we become overstressed. So it's not only important for us to invest in our wellness, it's important for us as teachers to invest in supporting all of our students from a social, emotional, and behavioral standpoint. And that when we do that, it needs to be combined with our academic content so it permeates the fabric of our system rather than be seen as a job for other people. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that along our series. And finally, number four, the core features of a multi-tiered system of support are absolutely essential to install any evidence-based practice. It's also essential to install school mental health. And we're going to start to talk more at length about what those MTSS features are. Let's talk about those core features, and then let's draw a connect point in how they're translating into the virtual conditions. So again, let's take that balcony view about mental health in general. One of the things I'm starting to see as I work with states across the country is that there is a lot of momentum and energy around mental health. And there's a little bit of funding that's been allocated in our communities to support mental health being much more of a priority than it ever was. And they're doing awesome things, right? They're having data-informed responses. They're hiring more social emotional experts, right? We know those ratios are awful. And it's really awesome to see that we're investing in a workforce that has this expertise, this technical expertise. That's amazing. We also are seeing money go towards and priority for selecting social emotional behavior curriculum, right? Again, awesome. We're seeing a lot more training of staff on trauma-informed practices, right? This call to our attention about being informed about how the brain responds under long periods of stress. Again, an awesome investment. And we're also seeing strengthening partnerships with our families and our community providers. Again, really good choices. But I'm going to push back a little bit. I don't think that's going to be enough to handle the magnitude of what we're going to see, the staggering number of need. So we're going to invest, and yes, let's do all of these things on the left-hand column, but when we do them within an MTSS logic, when we hire social emotional experts, but we adapt their role, where we embed them in the fabric of our school community, and they serve with us on our teams, and they make decisions with us on what our system needs to do differently, that's going to be the game changer. When they're able to participate across all tiers of support, when they're there to grow the capacity of all the staff to feel more confident and competent about their personal skills and teaching those skills and mental health skills and strategies in their classrooms, that's going to be so much more powerful in our redesign. When we're selecting our social emotional behavior curriculum, when we have a team using a formal process that's team-based, that we're using data to prioritize which skills we're going to select, we're going to teach, and we're going to give teachers time to figure out how to embed it, incorporate it, and teach it right along our academic content. That's going to be the game changer. When we train our staff on trauma-informed care, we're going to train teams of who represent our staff during the training, and we're going to give those teams time to embed that new learning into an action planning process and build off the strengths of their community. Right? That's what MTSS allows us to do, is kick it up a notch, if you will. And then finally, yes, we're going to strengthen partnerships, but we're going to expand a current team that already has developed out an infrastructure, and we're going to launch from there that's data informed. So yes, on the left-hand side, we are going to invest in these things, but imagine what we could do if we invest in incorporating these through the MTSS logic. So let's talk and take a little bit of a deep dive into each of these items. So under the core features, yes, teams are absolutely critical. This is a team sport. And in the next slide, you'll see that we want to design, to start with, one district community leadership team. And they're going to have very specific steps to go through. And we're going to make sure that we've got people who have the authority to make critical decisions to be serving on this team. The game changer will be when we can figure out how to blend funding and how to align funding, when we can talk through confidentiality issues, when we can talk through some of the stigma associated with mental health. So it's going to be critically important that the unit of innovation is actually at the district community level, and their sole job is going to be supporting the school level implementation teams. We're also going to make sure that our family and youth are represented. And we're going to make sure that all of the mental health related initiatives are facilitated through that one set of multidisciplinary teams. So teams is really going to be important. And for those of you who have been implementing PBIS and using the tiered fidelity inventory, we're going to continue to use the tiered fidelity inventory, right? That's going to be the foundation by which we launch from. So it will be critically important that we stay with the structures that we've already developed. Now you can see in this example that we have some enhancements here. So at a school level, you might already have a PBIS Tier 1 leadership team. And now we're going to ask you, to what extent can you pull in community providers to sit on that team with you and make decisions together? To what extent can you provide and pull in families who represent your community into that team? Because they're going to be able to provide you an expanded view and context about how students live outside of the school and how their lives impact their ability to be successful in school, right? Those forecasting data, to be able to actively pursue and uncovering patterns that are emerging in the community, to see that coming and say, you know what? We have to kick it up a notch. We've got to strengthen our Tier 1 approach because we've got too much happening in our community that we can't possibly individualize supports for all the need. We've got to really pull back and figure out ways to strengthen and support everybody. And so it really helps us kind of take that balcony view and look at that aggregate data set to kind of get in front of things before they really become too overwhelming for the system that we're sitting in right now. So to be really clear, we're going to launch from the TFI. We're going to use an action planning form that drills down to what the enhancement features are. So in this case, we're going to look to see what other members we can bring into that team. And we're going to make sure that our memorandum of understanding is really clearly defining our roles and functions as we expand our team and expand our lens. So in that core feature, we realize that we are in distance learning for the most part. And we're watching teams that have been working together for many years almost dissolve in the last 6 to 9 months, right? Because they haven't been, and not everybody, but they haven't necessarily been meeting in the virtual space. And so we want to make sure that if you've invested in a team, a PBIS team, that it might be a good time to add critical friends to that team, but it's going to be important to continue to meet no matter what the teaching and learning context is this school year. And so we've modified the agenda form that we use for our teams to consider and to make sure that we're setting in motion norms when we meet face to face, and team norms when we're meeting in the virtual space. And we've also incorporated wellness checks. So we're augmenting an existing problem-solving agenda, and we're making sure that no matter if we're in distance learning, hybrid, or face-to-face, that we do meet at least monthly, that we are continuing to use data, that we are thinking about critical friends that we need to bring into our team, like medical professionals, public health professionals, our nurses, because we're bringing those safety precautions into this team as well. So to what extent can you have consistent meeting time, meeting agenda, and data for decision-making processes established across those different scenarios? We're going to move to use of data and talk about that in the virtual space. So going back, I want to just highlight again, teams, one set of teams. Mental health leaders are serving across, they're serving with you on those teams, and that you are consistently meeting, whether that is in hybrid, virtual, or face-to-face. The next core feature is talking about the use of data. So let's talk about this expanding our data resources. It's going to be, again, as we bring other partners into this work, important to kind of get a pulse of what's going on in your community. And in schools, we have a ton of data sources that we rely on. And so I've populated a couple of examples of some of the data that we normally look at and pre-COVID, right? We may be looking at climate surveys. We're maybe looking at youth risk assessment surveys. We may be looking at the academic health, how many students are on track to graduate. We may be looking at social behavioral health data, that data related to instructional time or behavior and reading proficiencies. We could be looking at attendance data, right? So we have a lot of data that we kind of comb through. To what extent does your expanded team first talk about data in the aggregate? Notice we're not talking about the individual student level. We're just kind of getting a health index about some general trends and key findings that we're seeing in the data. I'm going to argue, though, that that's not quite good enough. And when we bring our community partners to the table, there's a wider scope of data that they can bring with them that informs us about what the needs of our neighborhood, our community are. And you can see in this example we've provided you, there's some data around elevated lead levels for this particular school community as compared to the rest of the district, and elevated behavior risk data, surveillance data. So you can see right at the bottom, 15% of the families that we're serving are without health insurance, and that's compared to 6% district-wide. And I call your attention to that because it's important as we allocate and redistribute resources that we're looking at that type of data that informs us about how we're deploying our resources and our technical assistance that in kind of that aggregate view. So this is about thinking about expanding our data sources, using data that we may have collected last year, but taking advantage of what was kind of already in motion. What data can we take advantage of that was already there before? And then we're going to combine that data with the current data sources we might have right now. So it might be nice to know, right, as your team, what are the percentage of students engaging in distance learning? What are the percentage of students in your neighborhood, in your school community that are receiving food support? What about the percentage of families that have been personally impacted, either loss of a family member ill, they might be have a first responder, an essential worker, where there might be a loss of employment and housing. To what extent do you know the kids that you're serving in your classroom, in your school, in your community, to what extent, and in aggregate, again, has your community been impacted by COVID and by other environmental impacts and other social justice impacts? And then finally, what about the percentage of students and staff who are just going to be unable to return face-to-face? The FTF is face-to-face. What are some of the, it could be because of underlying medical conditions, or they might be living with an at-risk family member. So again, really kind of, we want to stay at the aggregate level. We want to have this broad kind of balcony view about what the large percentages are that our community members are facing, because this is going to allow us to prioritize the specific need, and customize to and match it to the specific needs of the people we're serving. It's going to help us harness the lack of resources, harness those resources, and pinpoint with a lot more accuracy what is needed. We realize that there's a lot of information out there with respect to gathering a lot more information remotely. And so we wanted to provide some links to using the data platforms like Check and Checkout Swiss and iSwiss during distance learning. We've got information related to how you might conduct a TFI walkthrough, a tiered fidelity inventory walkthrough in a remote time, and how to collect referrals during distance learning. You know, I heard one thing that was really, really fascinating recently about collecting office referrals during distance learning, and I'm was curious, be interested to find out what you think of this. But there was a rule in one of the systems that I'm working with that they are no longer going to use the term office discipline referral, that they are going to talk about a care ticket. And that when they start to observe behaviors that might not be appropriate for remote setting or face-to-face setting, whether that's in the classroom, hallway, et cetera, that it's not about sending somebody to the office. It's about, we need to redesign the system and figure out ways that we can connect with that child, because they're telling us that they need more from us. So they're going to switch their language away from using office discipline referrals to saying, I need to write a care ticket because we need to kick it up a notch, and we need to make sure that we have that we're supporting that child, and it's not just about taking the trip to the office. So I just thought I would offer that as we think about redesigning the system and challenging everything about it, that we anchor it in using some different terminology. The next one is about ensuring early access. And in doing that, we have formal and informal data that we are going to use to signal when we need to kick it up a notch. So that team's responsibility is about actively uncovering what the needs are. And so in the next series of slides, we're gonna focus on screening, but really kind of broaden out our notion about what screening is. We want to, again, have that tier 1 team actively uncover not only the needs of our community, but the strengths of our community, because we're going to launch from there. So both data sets are going to be really important, right? Those formal and informal screenings. It's important to know that if you already don't have a formal universal screener, now is not the time to start. That we can lean in on some of the natural data sources right now, but we are really mindful that we're already at a stress level that's beyond what we've ever experienced before, and we won't be able to take on any more new initiatives. Having said that, though, now could be the time where your district community leadership, those district leaders, might be in a position where they're looking through some universal screening tools to put in place down the road. We want to make sure that with that investment, we're using psychometrically sound screening tools. And we right now just want to wait to screen, right? We want to wait until students, families, and staff get back to a routine. So the investment right now is really about fidelity of implementation of tier 1 strategies in the virtual space. Or if you're so lucky, in the face-to-face space, right? So it's this intentionality right now in this adjustment period that we are developing relationships, even we're in distance platform, that we're supporting the heck out of our staff, and that we're scheduling that screening window after fidelity is reached with tier 1. And that might take a little bit longer this year. We also want to make sure that, that this is a perception measure, and that bias is inherent in any perception measure, which is why it's so important to make sure that right now during that adjustment period, it's about uncovering the strengths and fostering caring connections and deepening our relationships with every single student that we're engaged with, no matter the teaching and learning context. Under this notion of screening, we can also help teachers take some data on getting to know their students and being more intentional about connecting with them in the virtual platform. And so we wanted to offer a way to organize that information so that teachers can kind of do a weekly review of maybe some students that they don't quite know yet personally. And that on Monday, they might do an adjustment and say, you know what? This week is all going to be about Abby and Sammy. I'm going to pay really close attention to them in my distance, in my Zoom classroom, and I'm going to make sure that I discover something personal about them because they haven't quite warmed up in this virtual space. So this might be a way to be able to track that data in the virtual space and really pay attention to strengths and relationships as we think about doing some informal assessment down the road. And, you know, just out of curiosity, I think we've got a poll. We're wondering if about where you are with screening. So I'm just going to take a pause. And Kelsey, if you want to put the poll up, we're interested to know a little bit more about where you are with formal screening and informal screening. So do you collect data, but really not using that as a screening tool? Are you collecting and using existing data? Are you using maybe an informal or an abbreviated screener like a check-in? You've been maybe working to select a formal screening tool for all students, but maybe put it on hold, or you just went ahead and used a formal screening process. And then finally, you have a teacher, family, and student nomination process. So just kind of give us kind of where you are in this process. So it looks like you're like really even Steven here, but it looks like 33% of you use an informal screener, 19% are working to select a formal screener, and 23 are using a formal screener. That's fantastic. And that it looks like you've 26% of you have a teacher, family, student nomination process. That's awesome. Thank you. So you've got kind of some data that you could be collecting at the in distance platform. The team, though, is going to be charged with helping all teachers build a common routine. And at the school level, in order to build that routine, we are going to make sure that we as a team are providing prompts and supports to make sure that staff are consistently checking in with their students. And finally, we're going to use fidelity checks and outcome data to celebrate the heck out of what we're doing by way of fostering care and connections with every single student. A little bit more on screening. We want to make sure that when you do invest in a formal screening, that we're not looking at individual items. This is absolutely not a diagnostic assessment. We use our formal screening data, the total score, we combine it with other data sources such as attendance and engagement and academic performance. And we use that to inform ways to strengthen our Tier 1 instruction. We also want to make sure that as we're examining our grade level and class level data, that when we detect percentages that are greater than 15 to 20%, it's really a class-wide response we need to invest in. And we need to have a clear plan when students do have a positive screen. Don't necessarily assume that every student with a positive screen will need intensive supports, but it's important to set up a 2-week window and considering hiring short-term clinicians that are able to do additional diagnostic assessments and develop a team-based supports as we move forward. So we only have 2 more core features to go. Again, in an MTSS, when we're using and anchoring this work in anchoring our work in the core features, we want to make sure that that team has developed a formal process for selecting interventions. We want to make sure that maybe perhaps even putting it on your agenda might create a prompt and might create a formal routine by which whenever there's a moment in time where you're suggesting to add one more thing to our plate, the team kind of pushes back and say, that sounds great, but let's make sure that we, first of all, have a need for this new thing, right? That the intervention we're selecting is a good fit for our system, that the research indicates that the intervention has evidence to address our need, and that we actually have the capacity, that bandwidth right now to take on one more thing. So the team is going to be really, one of their big responsibilities is to uncover need and strengths. And the second one is to slow things down and invest in a small number of evidence-based practices that yield big impact for the students and families and staff that they're serving. So really establish that formal selection process. It's going to be important that before we add one more thing, we want to take stock of what we're doing. We want to make sure that we could invest in something that might lead to meeting the vast majority of need. So it might be that we reconsider repurposing a current practice or consider expanding a current practice. Let me tell you what that looks like in the next slide. Many times our gut reaction is just to add one more thing, right? We want to add this trauma-informed care team. We want to add this curriculum. I'm going to ask that you invest in building a resilient community and expand your tier 1 components before you make that decision. And I say this because we know that many of the items in the tier 1 components automatically hit the trauma-informed button and hit the social-emotional button, right? We're all incorporating all of these social emotional behavior initiatives under that one umbrella. What if we took stock and said, how do we really expand what we're already doing in the tier 1 realm, right? And ask yourselves, to what extent do we have in every single classroom in our school predictable, safe, stable environments? And have we done that in the distance platforms? Have we done that in the virtual settings? To what extent have we embedded instructions for being deliberate about teaching expectations, procedures, and social emotional skills? Have we really embedded that into our academic content? To what extent do we set up daily routines for every single staff and all the classrooms to build a sense of community, to foster relationships, to take time out and make sure that everybody's experiencing a positive connection? That we've been explicit in clearly defining ways for staff to ask for help. And remember that self-care teaching matrix I showed you earlier on this afternoon? That's exactly what we need to do. We need to be very clear about ways that our staff can ask for help. To what extent in your tier 1 implementation do you have positive greetings and positive social interactions throughout the day? And can you count them, right? Can you have somebody go out and just take a quick count and celebrate the heck out of all of the positive greetings and social interactions that happen? Because that's what mental health looks like. That's what's going to repair the brain as we build a resilient community for everybody. To what extent do we have teacher connectedness and wellness activities for our staff? And to what extent are our professional learning and support networks aligned with what we're trying to accomplish together? So before you add one more thing to your plate, before you're considering this, make sure you double down on your tier 1 supports and make sure that you're incorporating the social emotional and the trauma strategies that are so easy to install within the tier 1 components. And I think our trauma brief did a really good job of that, which will go into a lot more depth and detail during our next time together. If you do decide, however, to select an evidence-based curriculum specific to trauma-informed care, there are some some structures that will help guide your team through the process of making the right selection for the needs that you have in your community. And so we just wanted to offer a couple of resources here: the Hexagon tool, the Consumer Guide to Selecting Evidence-Based Mental Health Services, and then we've got a protocol for identifying evidence-based practice within a PBIS framework, right? We will never tell you what to do. We are going to give you guidance on how to make decisions that, that make sense for your community and fit the culture and the context and the need. Okay, last core feature: ongoing professional development and coaching. So we want, despite us being in distance learning and virtual platforms, we want to continue to train and support our staff. And so what you'll see is how we're changing course ever so slightly, but we are providing ongoing professional development and providing coaching supports. So a couple questions for you. Does the district MTSS team have a professional development plan that includes opportunities for all staff to learn about trauma, its impact on youth, and the evidence-based practices that will be integrated across the tiers? Right? So we want everybody to be informed. We want the content knowledge to increase, but we also want to make sure that we're giving time and space to figure out how to apply that new content into our community. We want to make sure that within our coaching and training opportunities that we're giving staff the right supports, and we're giving them supports, especially those who are experiencing secondary trauma. So in what ways are you uncovering the needs for your staff? In what ways are you creating the conditions for staff to be successful? Here are some of the ways that we have been modifying professional development coaching. We're still focusing on building fluency and accuracy with new practices, right? We still need opportunities to practice as adults. The same instructional logic applies for all humans, including our staff. We are going to make sure we apply the same team-based logistics and principles of adult learning, right? And we're going to make sure that there's real-time coaching taking effect when we are training in these modified virtual platforms. We need to make sure that we've got adequate time for action planning, right? That application of that new knowledge into the space of our community. Here are some virtual examples, right? We're still asking teams to come on and train with us. We're modifying our schedule to make sure that we're providing shorter chunks of content. So where we might, in the past, we might have had 2 days back to back of team training. Now we might have a 1 2-hour content training and then follow up team-based action planning time. And we might do that in a series of 2-hour chunks rather than doing full days. We're making sure, though, that our district leadership participates in these trainings so that they can lean in and listen to what the specific needs of the classroom and the schools are, so that they can sit back and say, how do we redesign the systems and structures to make sure that these can get implemented with fidelity. And finally, we're recording everything, and we're giving these microdoses. We're chunking the recordings out to make sure that we can create content fluency. If you are new to this, you're new to a specific evidence-based practice, you don't necessarily have to be that proficient. You can listen to the recording as a team, and then the coach can coach you through, facilitate you through how we're going to incorporate this into our community.
Thank you, Susan. So thank you very much, Susan Barrett, for getting us kicked off with this first of our West Coast parties here. The rest of our series, as Susan and Kelsey had pointed out before, will take us through back and forth between systems and practices. The feedback in the chat pod throughout has been really helpful. Thanks for the reminder to spell out our acronyms. We get a little acronym heavy here. But the idea of the back and forth between the systems and practices, and this is an overlap and really mirroring that the intermingling of my favorite Venn diagram here of how our systems, data, and practices are situated within the outcomes we are trying to accomplish, and setting up for success moving forward. Part of that is the alignment. So the examples of how all of these pieces come together through our big components here of our positive behavior supports, or multi-tiered systems of support for behavior for my Washington folks. How to maximize impact? Well, join as a team. So bring your district team, bring your school team, come all together. Remember, we're trying to build this common knowledge of how pieces move together, and how they support one another. So we need that team approach. Make a plan. What are you going to do after the webinars? How are you going to reach out to your collaborators or plan with your team? What are you going to do to move this forward? So it isn't just learning that just kind of falls off to the wayside, but after the webinar, look at your data, look at your action plan. Take a deeper dive with ISF Volume 2, so the Interconnected Systems Framework. The second volume has been published on midwestpbs.org. I'm sure one of my collaborators here can get that on in the chat pod for us, and it will be on the pbis.org website very soon. This is the resource that Susan was talking about, the social emotional competencies within our positive behavioral support framework, as well as the interconnected system framework, school mental health, ebook, learning book, trauma-informed approach within a positive behavioral support framework. Again, we're not saying throw everything out and let's start again. You're always working on the systems. You're always, to some extent, using data. You have practices in place. Documents like the ones that we're sharing here and the information Susan has shared throughout will help you, give you some examples and non-examples of how to really push hard on the interconnecting pieces. How do we work together, and how do we ensure we are maximizing prevention through social emotional well-being and teaching wellness? Remember, wellness is a skill. And really using our knowledge of trauma to inform how we build those protective factors in our school. And I really love, Susan, I love looking at the community data, the risk, as well as the resource data. And I know when you actually walk through the implementation guides for the interconnected system framework, you do a resource audit, so you can see it's not just what's at risk, but that really comprehensive picture of the balancing forces and how we direct our priorities there. Okay, super. So we have a question in the chat pod, in the Q&A pod. In Washington State, one of the requirements from OSPI is we conduct a screener. And so what are the best strategies to roll this out? And Susan, I know you talked about informal screening, but it sounds like it's actually a screening mechanism that's more than informal, and I might be incorrect in that, so someone can correct me.
Well, I think I want to get a little bit more clarity. It's not my understanding that there's a requirement for a social emotional behavioral screener. I know through the dyslexia legislation, there is a requirement for academic screening. But Michaela, we can find that out for certain. But I will let Susan talk a little bit about some strategies, and I can put some of those resources in the chat as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have in the Advancing Education Effectiveness, Interconnecting School Mental Health and School-wide PBIS, the Volume 2 resource that you see in the middle of your screen right now really gives you step-by-step guidance on how to implement an interconnected system framework approach. And in those chapter 4, which is focused on district community, we actually give you a specific time for installing a formal screener that includes having the team select the appropriate screener for your need. It talks about training. It talks about the technology behind it. It talks about training teachers. So there's a really clear list of things to do with respect to beginning to launch, and this is formal screener inside your system. And it's really the role of the district community leadership team to do that. We should not have individual schools trying to figure this out on their own. The district really, it's really in the court of the district.
Yep, that's really great. So we have another question around screening from Alice, who wants to know if Alice should worry that teachers are being asked to screen students, including evaluating whether they think a student cheats or lies. And that's the screening plan at the district. And I was actually reading and writing about this last week, Alice. And when we have, it depends on if we're talking about a psychometrically validated screener, a screening tools. Sometimes these tools are set up with gates. So they're very broad. So first of all, screeners are not diagnostic. They kind of point us in the direction where we should pay more attention and potentially use other data, right, to inform our decision making. And when these measures are gated, that means that we do a broad sweep. Everyone gives feedback on a kiddo, and then the kiddos who have an elevated number or identifiers, then we look at them closer, then we look at them closer. So it's sometimes hard for teachers. As a former high school teacher, sometimes it's hard to know if you have a large class, what some of these kids, how they may behave. The screener is not our only data point, and we would certainly never give a diagnosis for a screen based on a screener. I'm wondering, Kelsey and Susan, if we think putting the Kathleen Lane's link to some of that information from her website, because it's very, very, some of the messages are very clear there. Also wondering if folks have other insights on that one.
Yeah, and so what I tried to do is take kind of the general guidelines from the work of Kathleen Lane and Wendy Oakes and others like Joni Splett and Kelly Perales, and incorporate that into the slide deck today. So what you see is kind of a combination of what's the best thinking right now around screening. Mm-hmm. That's why we focused and did a little bit more of a drill down on screening, given that this is a really big ask for districts right now, but it's really also very critical.
Right.
We do know that screeners that are more strength-based aren't, from the research, aren't as always good at uncovering the need. So we have to be really careful, but we have to recognize that they are inherently biased to start with. That's why we focus so much during the adjustment period on focusing on strengths of our students, getting to know their story, getting to know them, developing relationships, so we can strike much more of a balanced approach when we are filling out those forms.
Correct. And we would not want for just one teacher's opinion without other data sources to be the way we have a kiddo get intervention or we direct more resources there, right? We want to use multiple data points. So if we had one teacher who was scoring all of their kids, and based on that, we decided to sort kids into groups or individual planning, that is not going to be in best practice. That's not going to be best practices for the idea of screening kiddos. Okay. Ooh, there's some good questions in here. What are some suggestions you have for measuring student and adult resilience in a virtual context without worrying about overloading our staff and families with surveys?
Sierra, I love that question. That's such a great question. And I think one of the things we were trying to do in this setup, when I gave you the example, the problem solving agenda example, you actually can put some wellness checks in your meeting time, right? You can just build a routine where we're checking in on each other, where you make sure that we can call our staff attention to some employee assistance programs that might be available in your district, that we're taking time, we're taking a pause, we're making sure we are monitoring our own stress levels and being very clear and consistent about ways to ask for help. So in those informal surveys, I think we can look at data across time that lets us know basically how staff are feeling over a course of a number of meetings. And so I know we've got some examples from some of our ISF demonstration sites who have taken some wellness checks and shortened them to one or between 4 to 5 questions, and they're using that as an ongoing monitoring system to look to see how data are, how staff are trending in kind of the resilience category, if you will.
Yep. I love that the teacher-student connections template, Susan, in the PowerPoint. You could put so many different pieces in there. I thought that was really great.
Yeah, you could also do one for staff, right? You could take staff and say, to what extent are staff engaged? To what extent are staff able to accomplish the tasks? Or, just to kind of get a gauge for, do these staff feel connected in this virtual platform? So there's all different kinds of ways to kind of arrange that checklist.
That's great. We have another question that got in the chat pod. I think it's a really good one, from Angela asking, what were the percentages for kids? So back to slide, one of our slides at the beginning. What were the percentages for kids receiving treatment in school versus the community?
This actually this is a pretty new study. 23% of students actually receive mental health services inside schools. And students who receive evidence-based treatment in schools are 6 times more likely to complete their treatment.
Okay, that's great.
And I'm going to put a link to a meta-analysis that some of my Smart Center colleagues were involved in on the rates of mental health service utilization. Just came out. So I'm going to post that link in the chat.
That's where I got that. No,
yeah, that's what I figured.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to see if I missed anything in the chat pod here. That's all of our questions in the Q&A pod. Thank you for folks for checking in and asking questions. Jeanette early in the webinar said this looks like a very progressive approach. I think so, Jeanette. And I think Susan does a great job describing it and pulling all the pieces together. So thank you for making time to be here.
Yeah, so I can take it from here. I want to thank both Jessica and Susan for being here and sharing their wisdom. It is always very challenging, as many of us are learning to present virtually. So any feedback that you can provide to them, if you can share, a quick something, a takeaway, or something that made you think a little bit more about a question that you may have had, a resource that you learned. We'd love for you to drop that into the chat for us. And I'm going to go through these next couple of slides, and then we'll put the evaluation in the chat, as well. These next 2 slides, first of all, if you are in the Pacific Southwest MHTTC region, this is how you can get in touch with their center. So their email, phone number, website, you can join their newsletter. You don't have to be in their region to join their newsletter. I personally get their newsletter and find it very useful. They're also on social media as well. And the next slide has the information for our Northwest MHTTC Center. We also have a newsletter and are on social media, so feel free to reach out to us. So at this point, we just want to say thank you for all the work that you all are doing. Hope everyone has a relaxing and restful evening. And we just welcome you to reach out to us if you have any questions.